Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. Today we're talking about guilt, shame, and purity culture. Specifically, what it means to feel guilt and shame about arousal, about sex, and what that has to do with purity culture. For those of us who grew up in purity culture, we are aware of the ways, sort of, that it follows you. But some of those ways are a little more underground, a little more nefarious, and show up in places that you least expect it. A couple of videos I've done about purity culture have sort of raised some questions and maybe made people a little confused, so let's go ahead and do some definitions first. First definition is purity culture. When I talk about purity culture, I am not talking about one specific idea like from the 90s that people put purity rings on their fingers and pledge to keep themselves pure, aka not have sex, until marriage. I mean the entirety of a movement that made women feel that in order to be pure or worth marriage, that they had to be completely untouched until they married a man. And then once marriage happened, sex was wonderful and great, and they were supposed to be having it all the time with their husbands. On the other side of that, purity culture was teaching men that all of their thoughts were dirty, all of the things in their head were sinful and terrible. And then once they got married, they were allowed to think all of those things, but only about their wife. And any of the thoughts about anybody else, again, made them sinful, terrible humans. And oh yes, don't forget, once those marriage vows happened, all bets were off, all sexual impulses for each other would be fine, and you were just supposed to accept that that switch flipped as soon as you got married. Anybody who grew up in any sort of religious entity, 80s, 90s, and really after, is very aware of this push and this understanding of the way that things were taught. It wasn't just taught in churches though, y'all. This was taught in schools. This was taught, or not taught, in health classes. This idea really permeates society as a whole and has led to many, many people carrying guilt and shame into their understanding of sex and sexuality and arousal into their adulthood. So since so many of you are people who, well, experienced growing up in religious organizations, or at the very least under purity culture sort of guidelines, I'm willing to bet that some of you have experienced some of these symptoms of guilt and shame and negative impacts of the way purity culture has helped you or not helped you to understand who you are, what turns you on, what it means to be turned on, and what you're supposed to do about that, what you're not allowed to do about that. Another definition that I want to make sure that I talk to you about is what guilt is and what shame is. There's a lot of definitions out there, and this is not to say that this is the be-all end-all definition. There are other ones out there that fit very well. The ones that we're going to be going with here is guilt is something that you feel about something you do. Shame is what you feel about what you are. I don't necessarily want to say shame is internal because it's brought to you by external. Like inherently, shame doesn't actually exist until external things tell you should be ashamed. So people sometimes say, guilt is external, shame is internal. I don't really buy into that because inherently we don't necessarily show up in this world ashamed of our personhood, but purity culture takes care of that for us. When you feel guilt, it's about something you did that you think was wrong. When you feel shame, it's about something you think you are that you think is wrong. So the ways that purity culture put guilt and shame on an entire group of people for many decades. Purity culture taught us that every thought that we have in our heads is wrong and sinful. So every thought that comes up is wrong and sinful. If you tell someone that long enough, they are going to think that everything they think is wrong. They're going to second guess everything that they think. They are going to wonder if anything they think has any substance to it at all, whether it's sexual in nature or not. That is going to sit in the back of their head and make them second guess choices they make them second guess things that they think and things that they believe in for much, much longer than they actually believe in the stuff that the church teaches them. It also teaches women their bodies are traps for men. If they don't cover up and hide the things that are going on their bodies, they are intentionally laying a trap for a man to fall away from God. And then we wondered why so many women had so many problems with understanding that their bodies were not terrible and that they didn't need to hide their bodies or be ashamed of their bodies or any other negative things that we've all thought about our bodies for years because we were told that our bodies were leading these men to hell. Women were also taught that men couldn't help their thoughts and that they would have these impure thoughts about them if they were ever shown their body. So it was up to the women to cover up on their bathing suits and not show any flesh if they didn't have to, because they were responsible for
not leading their brethren to sin,
no matter what their age was. So in reality, teenage girls were told that if a man was looking at them and having thoughts about them that were way inappropriate for them as a minor and this man as an adult, that was their fault because they were wearing the outfits that they were wearing. So here we're seeing victim blaming. Here we're seeing the seeds of rape culture. Here we're seeing the understanding that these girls are responsible for all of the things that men are doing around them because men cannot control themselves, is what purity culture was telling them. We can see where that would lead to shame and guilt, right? They feel guilty for taking up space. They feel guilty for being in the vicinity of men and distracting them in that way. They also then do not feel like they have rights to their body because they've been told from a very young age that these men have rights to their body. So when someone invades your personal bubble and they feel like they have a right to because you're a woman and they're a man, you're already predisposed to not saying anything about it because you've already been taught that your responsibility is to make men comfortable. Your responsibility is to make that okay for them. So you make it okay for them. I don't know a whole lot of women that haven't had an experience where they walk away from an interaction with a man and they don't know why they feel uncomfortable. They don't know that they can necessarily pinpoint what happened. There was something uncomfortable and boundary breaching about it, something about the way the man approached it, the way he talked to her, the way he touched her possibly, and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what happened, but you know something was inappropriate that happened. But we all think,
good luck getting anyone to hear you,
because we've got those thoughts of our bodies are for consumption by other people. Take that to the other side. What purity culture was teaching men was that their thought life was uncontrollable and they didn't need to control it because there was no way for them to control it. But they were also being taught that their thoughts in their head were inherently evil and that because there was nothing they could do, they were disgusting and dirty creatures. So the best they could hope for was to find a woman to marry him and make him, worthwhile, because they would acknowledge that it was the woman's job to give worth to the man, but also that there was no inherent worth in the man himself because he could work and earn a living and provide for his family, but that was about it because everything else in him was pretty crappy, honestly. So here we've got groupings of people that are growing up feeling absolutely terrible about themselves, feeling shame about their thought life and the things that they think they can or can't do about it, feeling shame about their bodies and the way their bodies are looking as they continue to develop and continue to grow up. They're feeling guilt about how much they're doing for the opposite sex, and they're feeling guilt about what they're doing to the opposite sex, but not feeling like they have any autonomy or ability to affect change in those situations. And they're growing up stuck in these roles for a very, very, very long time. That's what the early years do. So say you break out of that. Say you leave the church and you deconstruct and you don't necessarily belong to a faith-based anything anymore. And say you understand that you're part of the LGBTQIA plus community, right? And so you are now in a relationship with someone who does not look like the person that you thought you'd be in a long-term relationship with when you were in the purity culture life, right? And you have conversations about intimacy. Maybe you are intimate with them. There are things that come up that you might never think would come up, because of that purity culture understanding that still sits somewhere in the back of your head, that shame and that guilt that has followed you, that even though you deconstructed and understood those things did not have any place in your actual worth, were still so ingrained for so long, you had no idea they were sitting back there until this stuff starts to happen. One of the ways that this shows up is you get embarrassed to, talk about sex in any kind of way. Intimacy itself is really embarrassing for you to talk about because you don't know how to talk about pleasure with your partner without feeling like it's some kind of a dirty thing. You might not have any idea how to explain what feels good to you or ask your partner what feels good to them. That might feel very, very intimidating and very scary. That vulnerability is a lot for people, especially people who grew up in purity culture, because you weren't taught to talk about pleasure. Pleasure was bad. It was something to be kept away from until you got married and then only experienced in that heteronormative life. So you've got the guilt of not being in a heteronormative life and the shame of having sexual arousal in the first place. And those conversations are so hard to have. Some people find themselves on the opposite end of the spectrum. They find themselves hypersexual because it's almost like the brain goes in the other direction and they're like,
look, you told me I couldn't have any of these feelings, so I'm gonna have more of those feelings than I've ever had before or ever thought I could have. Because I know this isn't bad, and I'm gonna prove to you that I'm not bad because I'm gonna feel this all of the time.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, unless it leads to risky behaviors and unsafe decisions. Another one of those things that doesn't get talked about a lot is the physical responses during intimacy. And the two I want to talk to you about are freezing or nausea. For some people, when they experience arousal and they experience purity culture in their past, their body will actually go into sort of like a freeze mode because they don't know what to do next. It really is processing sort of a trauma because the body is responding in that moment the way a body is meant to respond. And the brain is saying, whoa, 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 for so long and so intensely, we have understood this to be so wrong. So what do we do here? Like, how do we respond to this in any way? Do we get ourselves out of this? Do we lean into it? Like, what do we do? And the body freezes. And that can be really intimidating, especially if you're actually in the middle of an encounter with your partner. There are also a lot of people that when they experience arousal, feel nauseous, get a headache. Their body has an adverse reaction to feeling aroused because for so long they were told it was so bad. And that can get interpreted so many different ways. That can get interpreted like you're not attracted to your partner, or maybe you don't necessarily like to have sex. And that might be true. I don't want to discount that. Those things might also be true. And you should be listening to your body when those things come up. That doesn't automatically mean that. It could also mean that purity culture has had its hooks in you for long enough that your body is so confused when it feels these things, it was always told not to feel. For some people, when these very confusing things come up, it leads to anger. It leads to embarrassment, like we talked about before. It can lead to some really intense arguments between partners, especially when the partner hasn't gone through a purity culture detox or hasn't experienced that in their life. And there are things that you can do when this comes up. Obviously, one of the things that I would always advocate for is therapy if this is coming up for you and becoming problematic in your life. And that's not always accessible to people. I totally understand that. So some other things you can do is, number one, making sure you're talking about it with your partner, helping your partner understand it's not them, helping you understand it's not you. And these things can happen and they can be okay when they happen is huge. Helping to normalize the fact that feelings are feelings and bodies react in different ways and all of that is okay really will go a long way to helping you to turn up on the other end of this and understand that this is not something you asked for or something you did to yourself. This is a result of years of teaching of something that was incorrect and never should have been taught to you in the first place. Also talking to other people who may have grown up in similar ways and honestly may be experiencing some of the same things that you're experiencing now. That's another good idea. I know I talk about it a lot, but in the comment section on some of these videos, people are talking about these experiences and finding people who are talking about those experiences, interacting with them and with their comments. There have been some great friendships that have grown out of the comment section in some of these videos where people have found out that they're not alone and they do have people they can talk to that have had similar experiences and have recovered from similar experiences. Reading up more on what it's like to have any of these things happen to you and to recover from any of these things. More and more, we are understanding how damaging certain experiences were in your younger years and how they impact you as you grow up. And while I wish it was faster and I wish there was more content out there about it, we're doing what we can. There is some. You can find these things on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok. There are people who are talking about these experiences in their own lives. Understanding that you are not alone is a huge step to helping move past how disruptive this can be in your life. Because the bottom line is you didn't ask to be indoctrinated with purity culture. You didn't ask to have this expectation of who you should be and how you should experience that put on you for that many years. And you didn't ask to be carrying this weight now. So as you work through that, that is one of the biggest things you can remind yourself of, is that this is not something that you deserve. This is not something that you asked for. And this is something that you can get past. It does take some time though. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other.